If you're new here, welcome. If you're not and you've been watching me flail around for a while, welcome back. My name is Kate, and I've been studying historical fashion with a heavy concentration on the 18th century for about 13 years now. More specifically, I've been looking at shifts. If you aren't familiar with a shift, it's something that 18th century and early 19th century ladies would have worn as the layer of clothing closest to the skin. The same garment has existed for hundreds of years for both men and women under different names. You might call it a smock, a shift, a shirt, a chemise. They're all basically the same thing, and for most of history they've been made from linen. If you're going more for the 19th century, a cotton chemise or shift is fine, but to be truly authentic to the 18th century, you really want to go for linen. Now I want to add that I don't care if you want to make a historically accurate shift. If you want to machine sew it out of whatever random fabric you have lying around, that's totally fine with me. I'm just here to tell you how I do it in order to be the most historically authentic that I possibly can with the knowledge that I currently have. Anyway, back to linen. It's a magical fabric that wicks away moisture from the body and keeps you cool, and if you want to try and tell me that cotton does the same thing, well, don't. It doesn't. I'm not listening. Unfortunately for us, decent shift and shirt weight linen is really hard to come by. 18th century linen was a lot different from its modern counterpart. The stuff we have now is made from shorter fibers and a looser weave, which is totally fine for modern clothing, but nearly useless for historical shifts and shirts. The switch to this suboptimal linen was actually pretty recent. If you've ever been to an antique store and looked through some of their vintage textiles like tablecloths or napkins, even ones from the 1960s, the linen is far and away better than what we can get our hands on now. Modern linen isn't a huge issue for later styles of shift with the simple hem on the sleeve, but for what we're going to be doing today, which is reproducing a mid to late 18th century shift with tiny gathers and buttonholes, it becomes a little bit more problematic. Unfortunately, my favorite linen that I used for about 4 years is no longer being made, and the stuff that our fabric fairy godparents at Burnley and Trowbridge have had, which is pretty great, is out of stock at the time I'm filming this video. I'm going to link it down below though, just in case they get it back. Now that I've gotten that off my chest, I'm going to point out that shifts don't have to be white. If the person you're trying to portray is of a middling or lower sort, or even just someone who's extremely economical, there's no reason you can't have a naturally colored linen shift. In the 18th century, a person might have actually tried to save money by making the body of their shift out of a natural linen and making the sleeves out of a much finer material. So you have that option too. Today I'm using a super fine white Irish linen. This shift is going to be fitted to my daughter because of course she's outgrown the one she had before. Children, am I right? And we really need this item to proceed with the project that she and I are working on. The interesting thing about fitting shifts though is that they generally weren't. As I understand it from 18th century ads and my favorite reference, cutting out apparel for the poor, shift linen was woven in a few select widths: 1 yard, 7/8 of a yard, and 3/4 of a yard. The 7/8 of a yard, or approximately 31 and a bit inches, would have been the most common for most bodies. I believe most people would have purchased their shifts rather than making them at home because it takes roughly an age to stitch up a shift, and for all but the most financially disadvantaged people, you would have had at least 2. Wearing them every single day as your innermost layer, they're going to get gross, they're going to get grimy, they're going to essentially disintegrate over time, so you're going to constantly need more shifts. Since the fabric was the expense and the labor was cheap, side-eye to the modern garment industry with their continuously underpaid workers, this is not new. Many people in the 18th century would have preferred to shell out a small fee in order to avoid spending an entire day or two putting roughly 8 million stitches into a bit of linen. So, now that I've completely scared you off, let's get into it. First off, we're all going to completely ignore my previous statement that shifts weren't super fitted and go ahead and draft one to measurements just to prove we can. Measurements needed include shoulder to mid-calf, or however long you want the shift, chest, hip, shoulder to shoulder across the front, desired neckline depth from the top of the shoulder, your flexed bicep, shoulder to just around the crook of the elbow, and the widest part of the flexed forearm. The first thing I'm going to do is write down all of the measurements that I just took so that they're in the same place. Your measurements may be a bit different or a lot different, but the principle is the same. Sleeves on 18th century shifts varied, and in the 1770s they weren't quite as full as in previous decades, but you do still want quite a bit of room to get some nice gathering in. Honestly, the wider the sleeve, the easier the gathering is, but we don't want this too bulky either. Apart from giving myself some seam allowance, I'm adding an arbitrary 3 inches here. Your mileage may vary. To determine the size of the shift body, I'm going to look at the chest, hip, and length measurements. I'm going to take the hip measurement and add a seemingly random but magical 10 inches plus 1 inch seam allowance, then divide that number by 2. This will be the width of our shift body. Determining the length is a little simpler, as it's just the desired length of the finished shift multiplied by 2. Seam allowance can be added, but because I intend to stitch a very tiny hem, and I added a little bit at my desired length, I'm not bothering with it here. Time for graphing. If each square equals 2 inches, this is what our shift body will look like. Before proceeding, I'm going to find the center. This will be the shoulder crease. Next, I'm going to mark the shoulder width plus 1 inch. I'll show you why this is important later, but it's less about seam allowance and more that you really don't want the gathered edge of your sleeve right up on the shoulder bone. With that determined, I can now find the halfway point between the bottom edge and shoulder crease on all 4 sides. This is going to show me where to draw the lines to cut the gores. Using a straight edge, drawing between the shoulder point and the marked halfway points on the sides. If I extend the lines, that shows where the gores will end up once they've been cut off and reattached. Next, I need to find the center point of the shift at the shoulder crease line. Since the desired neckline depth is 5 inches, I'm making it about 4.5 inches down here to give some room to hem. I know for a fact that I want the shoulder strap area to be 3 inches before seaming, so I've marked that out. The actual width of this area will really depend on your own preference for neckline style and for your own body shape. I have a few neckline templates that I use for custom shifts, and it's always a gamble as to whether it's going to really work because I don't usually get to measure that person myself. Returning to the diagram, I'm taking a page out of my favorite reference again and fitting 2 little underarm gussets into the space that will be cut out for the neck opening. Just for reference, here are the sleeves on the grid. Cuffs are the last thing we need to figure out for now. The forearm measurement I'm working with here is 7.5 inches, so I'm just going to add an inch for seam allowance. I like to cut my cuffs about 2 inches wide for adults, but as this is for a child, I'm making them a bit narrower at 1.5 inches. Listen, I understand that sitting and pulling threads out of linen sounds like an absolute waste of time, and sometimes I agree that it's not necessary. Hand sewing a shift though, well, the perfectly on-grain edges really help, so mark your shapes, snip, and pull your threads out. It's equally satisfying and life-ruining, so enjoy. To cut out the gores, I'm folding my pre-cut and iron shift body into quarters. Just to make sure nothing shifts, I'm putting a few pins along the edges to keep everything in line. Once everything is arranged neatly, I'm going to make the same marks as discussed earlier on the diagram. Shoulder crease, halfway point, shoulder width, etc. Once everything is marked, I'm taking a yardstick to draw a straight line between the shoulder point and the side. After that, I'm carefully cutting off the gores. To cut the neck opening, I'm folding the shift body from hem to hem just down the very center. You may find it useful to line up your crease along a straight edge because it is linen and it does tend to go wibbly. After marking the shoulder width and the neckline depth in the front, as well as the point on the back that was determined by nothing other than that looks right, I'm freehanding the neck opening in true chaotic neutral fashion. Don't do that unless you're totally fine with making it the wrong shape. I suggest making a small opening, sticking your head through, and tracing around your body to determine the neckline. Don't forget to add seam allowance. There are other tutorials on this, which I'll link below. Once you've cut your neck opening, very carefully fold up your shift so that you can cut out the gussets. The gussets I'm cutting here are going to be about 3.5 inch squares, which is fine for a tiny person, but adults will need something more like 5 inches. After gussets, I quickly cut the sleeves and the cuffs, and then all the pieces were ready. To begin, you'll need a thimble, scissors, linen thread, beeswax, unicorn optional, basting thread, pins, and needle. Starting at the center back, I'm carefully basting a tiny 1/8 of an inch all the way around. If you take only one thing away from this tutorial, I hope it is this: hem your neckline first. Linen is the type of fabric that will stretch out if you even think about maybe someday looking at it sideways. I don't care if you just leave your shift pieces sitting in a drawer for 6 months. The neckline is going to stretch out. Ask me how I know. Once this is done, you can breathe a sigh of relief because it's a lot harder for the neckline to stretch out when it's basted. With this basted edge, we can fold it over again and hem the neckline down with about 10 stitches to the inch. With the neckline finished, it's safe to pull out the basting stitches. If you'd like, you can put your initials or the date or a few other different symbols right here at the center front of the neckline. I'm not going to do that today, but I may do a tutorial on that in the future. On to the sleeves. The first step is to hem up part of the side of each sleeve so we can create an opening later. I should have made this area shorter, but forgot that this was a mini shift, so 3 inches is a bit much. It's great for an adult size shift though. Once I've marked the end point on both sides, I put in a 1/8 of an inch hem. After repeating this hem on the opposite side, this is now the end of the sleeve. Before I do anything else, I need to prepare the cuff bands. I do this by folding them in half lengthwise, being very careful to stay on grain. If this linen wasn't so light, I could pull threads to mark my folds, but that's not possible here. With the top edge fold pressed down, I'm folding in 1/2 inch on the ends and 1/4 inch at the top and bottom. This will vary depending on the width of your cuff. In order to gather the sleeve to the cuff, I need to run 2 lines of small, very even running stitches along the end. If you want to go cross-eyed, you can sit here and pass the thread over and under the fabric every 4 to 5 threads, which I used to do. At this point, I can thankfully eyeball it. The main point is that the stitch lines need to be absolutely parallel to each other and the sleeve edge. Time for gathering. To make sure I do this evenly, I am dividing both the cuff and the sleeve end into quarters, and then pinning these points to each other. I'm going to place the wrong side of the cuff to the right side of the sleeve. There is another method that involves gathering the sleeve in small segments, but because this is such a small sleeve, I'm not going to bother. When everything is pinned, pull the gathering threads and adjust the gathered fabric until it lays nicely. You may have heard these called stroked gathers before, but that's not really an 18th century term. The reason they have adopted this name, though, is that it is sometimes necessary to literally stroke the gathers with a blunt object after pulling your gathering threads in order to make them neat and even. If your running stitches are tidy enough, though, this may only be minimally necessary. Once you like the tension and the look of the gathers, you might find it useful to wind the end of the gathering thread in a figure 8 around the pins on each end of the cuff. To attach the gathers to the cuff, I'm first securing my thread to the very edge of the band, and then taking a few tiny whip stitches to affix that hemmed edge of the sleeve to this point. From there until the opposite end of the sleeve, I'm taking up each individual gather and slip stitching it to the band. You may have to adjust the gathers as you go, and that's totally fine. While I'm stitching away here, I'm going to insert a picture of the last shift that I made, because the sleeves on this one were extremely full and therefore actually made it a lot easier to make the gathers look pretty. I was essentially stitching a gather to the cuff for every 2 threads of the weave. This was also much nicer linen, alas. This process requires a good bit of patience, but I promise you the end result is well worth it. When the sleeve and the cuff have been joined, I'm going to turn the whole thing over. To encase these raw edges, I just need to press down the same folds I made before. I like to secure the open ends of the cuff with a few whip stitches. To complete this piece, we basically repeat the process of stitching each individual gather to the cuff, but on the inside this time. Moving on from the cuff, the next step is to attach the underarm gusset. Laying the sleeve right side up with the cuff facing my body, I'm placing the gusset at the top right corner. From this vantage point, the top right edge of the gusset is the seam I'm going to be starting with. These pieces can be offset slightly to make felling the seams a bit easier later. I like to have the gusset piece be higher, for lack of a better word, than the sleeve edge. For the purposes of this tutorial, I'm using a 1/2 inch seam allowance that will be felled down to a 1/4 inch, but please feel free to make this smaller. To attach the gusset, I'm sewing tiny back stitches all the way down the side of it, but I'm leaving 1/4 inch unstitched at the corner in order to facilitate felling later. Ignore it for now. This part is a little difficult to explain, so please feel free to go back and pause and rewatch as needed. To affix the gusset to the other side of the sleeve, I'm matching the cuffs right sides together and sort of pulling on the corner of the gusset until I've created a straight line. Once the pieces are arranged, I start from the gusset end of the sleeve and backstitch until I reach that same point that was left free before. When I reach that free point, I'm going to knot my thread and return to the cuff end of the sleeve. This is where I'm going to create the split in the sleeve. Starting at the very base of the hemmed edges with the right sides together, I'm going to put in quite a few very strong whip stitches before I get started on the actual seam. When I'm confident that the sleeve opening will not bust even with the most vigorous fist bump, I start seaming down the edge of the sleeve until I get to that same free floating point on the gusset. Well, it finally happened. We've come to the first felled seam of the entire shift. First, I'm going to fell the side seam of the sleeve. Because I've offset these, I don't have to trim anything. This is just a matter of taking the longer piece of fabric and folding it under the shorter bit of fabric and then stitching it down. Once the side of the sleeve is felled, it's time to return to that free floating point on the gusset that I keep talking about. The idea here is to encase the remaining raw edges of the sleeve using the gusset. This has been left free to allow me to maneuver the fabric neatly around that corner. Because I didn't offset this part of the sleeve gusset seam, I have to trim off the extra. All that's needed now is to fold under the seam on the 2 sides of the gusset where it meets the sleeve and fell. are with a nearly completed sleeve. All of the seams have been backstitched and felled, and it's just about ready to go. There are just a few finishing touches left before we can move on. To finish the sleeve, I need to run 2 absolutely microscopic lines of backstitches along the top and the bottom of the cuff. If I had used slightly more robust linen, I could have just pulled threads earlier to mark where these stitch lines should go, but this fabric just can't take it. Instead, I'm carefully following the grain about 1/16 of an inch away from the top and the bottom edge. If your cuffs are wider, this can be farther from the edge. It just really depends. With the cuffs neatly reinforced, it's time to move on for buttonholes. If you plan to use sleeve buttons for your shift, measure the diameter of the button and mark that width about 1/4 inch away from the edge of the cuff. You don't want this too close to the edge because the buttonhole may travel sideways with use. If you're just using ribbon or tape to tie your sleeves closed like I will be, you can totally choose an arbitrary measurement or, like me, 5/8 of an inch because that's just what I'm used to. This is not a buttonhole tutorial, I apologize, but if you'd like to see one of those, please let me know in the comments along with anything else you'd like me to explain. For now, all you need to know is that I've marked these with my favorite heat-sensitive pens, opened the holes with snips because I'm not lucky enough to have a buttonhole chisel, then used heavily waxed linen thread to stitch around and reinforce the opening. Before I put the sleeve and time out for a while, I need to run another set of gathering stitches along the gusset edge. Doing this will facilitate fitting the sleeve into the shoulder when I get to that point. On to the gores. Place the shift right side up and focus on the bottom right edge for now. Place one gore on top, offsetting the edges slightly. Again, this isn't required, it just saves time on trimming seams later. Pin or baste the edge and backstitch. You'll want no fewer than 12 stitches to the inch here. Sew all the way along the side of the gore, but stop about an inch from the point. This may or may not be trimmed off later depending on how the flat felling process goes. Repeat this step for the other gore on the same side of the shift, using the diagram shown earlier as a placement guide. The main idea is to sew the straight, non-bias edge of each gore to the 4 straight edges of the shift body. Now I need to fold the shift in half, right sides together, and pin the 2 gores on one side together along the bias edge. I'm offsetting the seam a little bit here. Then I'm just going to backstitch all the way up to the point where the 2 gores meet each side of that shift body. This seems like as good a time as any to remind you that modern linen is the worst, and if we still had awesome 18th century linen with pretty usable selvages, we could just butt all the straight edges together and whip stitch 2/3 of this gore area, eliminating the need for extra bulk and felling. Speaking of which, that's where I'm headed next. Felling the gores is the most fiddly bit of the whole garment, so try not to throw things while you sort this out. I mean, you can, but just don't throw anything breakable. You need to be careful about which seam you fell first, because you're essentially making a felled seam sandwich. One will have to go first, then another will slightly encase that, and then the third will encase all of them. A lot of this will depend on whether or not you offset your seams, and if so, which way you did it. On this particular shift, the seam closest to me will be felled first. The seam in the middle will follow, and then the seam farthest away from me will encase the other 2 and become one with the side seam of the shift body, which we haven't gotten to just yet. You can see that I'm arranging this part before I begin felling the bottom, just so I know my order of operations. Once I have everything determined, I'm going to go ahead and fell 2 of the gore seams, but leave the one that will become one with the shift body until everything else is set in. of the shift, I might as well hem it. It gets a bit awkward over the bumpy felled seams, especially at the point where the two bias edges of the gores meet, but I'm just going to bend it to my will and proceed. Before I sew up the side seam, I'm going to set in the sleeve. If I was going to put the sleeve right into the side of the shift in its current state, the underarm gusset would be at waist level, which would make for a very uncomfortable outfit. Instead, I'm going to find the center point of the shoulder and mark that. Then, mark a space about 4 inches away on either side. This 8-inch space in combination with the underarm gusset will give more than enough room for the arm to pass through the sleeve, with a bit of extra space for growing. On your own shift, a good rule of thumb is to gather the sleeve head down to about your bicep measurement or maybe a tiny bit smaller. You definitely don't want to overfit this area. To attach the sleeve, I'm going to turn the shoulder area seam allowance under by 1/2 inch between the marks. From here, I can attach the gathered shoulder side of the sleeve the same way as I did attaching the sleeve to the cuff. Essentially, I'm going to divide and conquer the bulk, and then slip stitch each individual gather into place. With the top of the sleeve nicely sewn on, I need to pin the gusset and side seam. I'm going to attach the gusset in the same way it was attached to the sleeve, but using the side of the shift instead. The side seam of the shift is one that you don't really want to offset because that can make the gusset line up a bit oddly. After pinning my gusset and side seam in place, I start backstitching at the point where the gores and side seam will meet. This takes a bit of squishing to make sure your seam looks right from the outside, so be sure to check it before you proceed up toward the shoulder. Once I've reached the underarm, I return to the bottom of the shift and fell that remaining open seam. Remember, this is the one that will encase the other 2 felled gore seams, so try to have patience when you position it. I usually like to have the gusset fabric felled over the top of the shift body as shown here on another shift, but it's not a hard and fast rule. I wasn't thinking clearly when lining up the seams here, so I ended up having to fell in the other direction, but it really doesn't matter. It just goes to show you that you can make hundreds of the same thing and still mess up. We all mess up, and that's okay. With the side seams and gores finished, all I have to do is complete backstitching the gussets and then encase the raw edges. There are a few ways to handle protecting the raw edges where the sleeve is gathered to the shoulder. 1. Fell it as a normal seam. It's possible, it's just kind of a pain with all the bulk. 2. Leave them raw, but carefully overcast them to prevent fraying. Seriously, overcast hard. 3. Bind them. That's what I'm doing with this shift. To accomplish this, I'm basically going to take a strip of fabric 1 inch longer than the gathered sleeve head and fit it into the inside of the shift right along the shoulder seam. Just like I did when I was encasing the raw edges of the inside of the sleeve cuff, the gathers here are slip stitched to the one long edge of this reinforcement strap. Once that's secure, Smooth the rest of the strap over the shoulder and pin or baste to hold it. Once I like the arrangement of it, I stitch all the way around the reinforcement strap. Remember at the very beginning of this video where I said I wanted to have the gathered sleeve drop off the shoulder a bit? It doesn't have to drop off very far, just enough to keep it out of the way of the seams of your gown sleeves. There you have it. That's how you make a shift, and I hope that you will try it someday. But I do want to reiterate what I said before. If you don't have the time or the energy or the spoons to put this much effort into a piece of underwear, don't. You can do it by machine, or you can buy a kit to at least avoid the math, because everyone hates math, unless you don't hate math, in which case, good for you. Or you can just purchase one, or just honestly wear whatever you feel like wearing under your stays. There's no rule. This is just how I do it. Thank you so much for watching. I hope this was informative and useful to you. Please leave me a comment down below and tell me if there's anything I can clarify for you. If you liked the video, give it a thumbs up, subscribe if you haven't, and stick around because I'm starting to really like these tutorial things. Why is the light keep doing this? Jets. Always jets.